All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors. Sorry. I did have it here. I didn't want to just use it. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, to thank Czinn Teri Kahn for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos with gratitude to Hashem for their first grandson, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, Benjamin and Elys Wohl for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month, in thanking those who make the shiurim accessible beyond the confines of the Beis Midrash, specifically Moishe Abramson and Jeremy Lasson, to thank Shimmy Batsheva Messing for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos in honor of the Bas Mitzva of their daughter Lilah, to thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah, Leah bas Avrohom, and his great-grandmother Tziril bas Rav Dov. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Michael Goldsmith, a truly beautiful sponsorship for today's Daf, to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for allowing me to celebrate Pesach again this year. Last year, this is his quote, listen to this, Rabbi say, last year I was in a coma, on life support, suffering from COVID-19. This year, Baruch Hashem, I am alive, and learning together with the Chevra and Rabbi Silber every day doing the Daf Yomi. Mazel Tov on the conclusion of Pesachim. Incredible, Lasson. Incredible. And to thank the Plunka family for dedicating the shir today in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Rav Yosef Karo, Maran Habeis Yosef. Truly beautiful. We'll say pretty inspirational things. All right, with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Daf Hey, page 5. And we are picking up in Mirz Hashem on Daf Dalid Amud Beis. And I believe we left off at Ha'achin V'Hashutfin, which I will say again is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara says as follows. First of all, good morning to the Chevra on Zoom. It's just like learning together. It's like Kibbutz Galios over here. We have Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, we have Florida, St. Louis, Atlanta. Okay, we've got Baltimore, Baruch Hashem, basements, dining rooms. We've got everything. Although the Chevra in Baltimore, I don't know. Hopefully we'll welcome you back in Mirz Hashem soon. B'shah tova u'metzlachos. All right, I will say with that, really a great list to have everyone online. Quite beautiful. So we'll say, let's begin. So remember again, the Mishnah said as follows. The Mishnah made an interesting statement. The Mishnah said that when you have brothers who inherit an estate, so the Mishnah said essentially when they're chayiv in meiser behema, they're pater from kolbon, and when they're chayiv in kolbon, they're pater from meiser behema. So there's an inverse relationship between kolbon and meiser behema. So it says the Gemara, let's analyze this for just a moment. So when you have brothers who become partners, who are chayiv in kolbon, they are pater from meiser behema. What's that case? So we'll say, interestingly enough, that case is when they divide up the estate and then ultimately go ahead and re-enter into a partnership. So I want to point out something very interesting. The halacha is, the Tiklin Chadatin points out that jointly owned animals are exempt from Meiser Behema. In fact, if you take a look at the Tiklin Chadatin, so on the left-hand side, all the way on the bottom, about 5 lines over the bottom, B'shechilku v'chazu v'nishtatfu, as him chayavim bekalbon, d'chishechilku v'nosnin sela shalim b'shil shnehem havi ki'ilu lavin zemizeh. I say thank you so much. Thank you, Mamish. All right. It's going to be a good day. Baruch Hashem. Coffee's here. Incredible. Coffee flows like water in this year, by the way. It's Mamish. It tastes like... Thank you. So the Tiklin Chadatin writes, he says, Uptur meiser sheni, the eider shall shutfim pater de kishechalku batlu tfusas habayis. I'm sorry. So we'll say, interestingly, no, I skipped the line. Because the passage says, Kol Peter Sheger Behema Sheria Lecha. We'll say, to make a long story short, so the Tiklin Chadatin explains that by Meiser Behema, the Torah uses the Lasson of Lecha, which is singular. So only an animal owned by an individual is chayiv in Meiser Behema, but a jointly owned animal is patur. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, if you have brothers who divide up an estate, and then they go ahead and they reconstitute a partnership. So when that occurs, halacha l'maisa, they're chayiv in kalbon, right? Because the extra supplemental payments for the half shekel, because even if one pays on behalf of the other, it's considered to be like a loan, but they are pater from Meiser Behema because any jointly owned animal is pater from Meiser Behema. Shechayavim Meiser Behema b'turim min ha'kalbon. What's the case where they're chayiv in Meiser Behema and pater from kalbon? B'shelo chilku, where they did not divide up the estate. Now, both, it is actually very interesting. Where you have brothers inherit a deceased father and they did not yet divide up the estate, so the halacha is that the undivided estate is considered to be the property of one individual. Which individual? Interestingly enough, the deceased father. So because an undivided estate is considered to be the property of one person, therefore they'll be chayiv in Meiser Behema. Why they chayiv in Meiser Behema? Because again, halacha l'maisa is considered to be the animal owned by one person. Masha'in kain, they won't be chayiv in kalbon. Good. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Lezer, v'hein shechilku gedim keneged tiyashim, utiyashim keneged gedim. So we'll say, however, this is only, when do we assume that the estate is divided up? The estate is divided up, and ultimately, again, now there are individual owners when you went ahead and you divided different parts among different brothers. So let's say one brother got the sheep, another brother got the ram. However, avalim chilku gedim keneged gedim, utiyashim keneged tiyashim, hu chelkom yishah harishon. But we'll say, if halacha l'maisa, you divide every single part of the estate equally, so every brother gets a share in everything, then that is as if the original estate is intact. But we'll say, interesting idea, because what we assume is like this. In general, when a father leaves a Yerusha, let's assume for a moment that a father did not designate how much each son or what each son is supposed to receive. Just to keep things even easier, let's just assume for a moment that the oldest is a daughter. So there's no Bechar with Pishnaim, and you have three brothers. So the three brothers are going to go ahead and divide the estate equally. See, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, when they go ahead and, so each brother technically has a chilik, has a portion in every single part of property of the estate. So there are two ways to divide the estate. If you go ahead and you just say, look, we're not going to give each brother a chilik in everything, but instead, you know what, you take the sheep, you take the ram. So we'll make sure that financially everyone gets the same thing, but Allah chalamais, everyone's going to get a separate piece. So the Gemara sees that much more as a case of brothers who divide up an estate, each have their own share, and if they choose to go ahead and get back together, that is a brand new partnership that's been formed. Masha'im kain, when brothers each receive a chilek of every single type of property in the estate, so halacha l'maisa, the Gemara views that as if the original estate is intact. Interesting chilek. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Afilu chelku gedim keneged gedim, utiyashim keneged tiyashim. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Even if halacha l'maisa, you divide each part of the estate amongst each of the brothers, kiluku chosein, they are considered to be as purchasers from one another. Upeturin min ha-meiser, and ultimately, again, they are exempt from meiser. Kiahu de taninan kaman meiser behema. As we discussed, halakuach. If you go out and you purchase an untithed animal, or one was given to matana, pater mi meiser behema. Ultimately, it is exempt from meiser behema. Good. Reb Chia, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, boy, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, boy, velama less non amrinan pamishen chayim bazeh bazeh. Shabbos say. So the Gemara now gave two examples. There are some times where brothers who divide up an estate will be chayiv in meiser behema, pater from kalbon. Sometimes they'll be chayiv in kalbon, pater from meiser behema. But you left out a case, says the Gemara. Why don't you say that there are times where you'll be chayiv in both kalbon and meiser behema, top of hay, or pamishen p'tur mizeh mizeh. And sometimes where brothers will be pater from both kalbon and meiser. In other words, why don't you bring down those cases as well? Both says skip the parentheses. For example, interesting case. What if the brothers split up the rest of the property of the estate, but they did not split up the livestock? All right, so we'll say, so we split up everything else, but not the livestock. So what's the halacha? So we'll say in that case, because remember, we'll say, what happens when you don't split up livestock? What's the status of the livestock? Technically, who owns the livestock? Right? The estate, we'll call it, right? The dead father, right? The estate owns it. Oh, so if the estate owns it, then is it chayiv in meiser behema? Right? The answer is yes. Why? Because it only has one owner. So we'll say you could have but if they divided up the rest of the assets, then kind of every brother is his own entity, and therefore when they give machzah shekel, they have to pay a kalbon on every machzas a shekel. See, interestingly enough, you could have a case of being chayiv in both meiser behema as well as kalbon. A case where they divided up the call it the property, but not the livestock. Similarly, however, for example, if they divided up the livestock but did not divide up the rest of the property, they would be patur from both kalbon and meiser sheni and meiser. I'm sorry, because also remember again, if they divided up the animals, then ultimately again that is animals owned in partnership, and therefore halacha l'maisa. Not chayv meiser behema, but if they did not go ahead and not chayv meiser behema, and also patur from kalbon. So why do we add those cases as well? Amra mana hada da'at amra b'shelo haisa behema rov, avalim haisa behema rov hein ikar nechasin. To which Ramana says that works fine as long as animals were not the majority of the estate. But if the majority of the estate was made up of livestock, then ultimately again they become the ikar nechasim. Good, and therefore we'll say, for example, that would mean is if the animals were the majority of the estate and the animals were not divided up, that would be equivalent to having the estate not divided up and therefore only owned by one person, the deceased father. Rab Avin Amr Rab Simi Boy Mipnei Sha'asisan Ka'adam Echad Eitzel Meiser Behema At Potro Min HaKalbon. So the Gemara says, because ultimately by Meiser Behema you've made them as one person, does that go ahead and exempt them from Kalbon? Amrlei Lo Shanyahi. Is this not different than the following case? Shu no sin sela echad shlema. Both say, why would this be any different case, right? From one who gives an entire seller from an undivided estate, in which case there would be a chiyuv of kalbon. If that's the case, based on this, you would say that even if they divide up the estate and then subsequently reconstitute a partnership, you should be chayiv in meiser behema and patur from kalbon. Vitaninon, and yet we learned chayav in kalbon up to meiser behema, that ultimately again one is chayiv in kalbon and patur from meiser behema. Good. So we'll say. So bottom line, what comes out from this is as follows: that the Mishnah points out for us that there is an inverse relationship between kalbon and meiser behema. So remember again, for the part by meiser behema to remember is by meiser behema halacha l'maisa, when the animals are owned by partners, the animals are exempt from meiser behema. When the animals are owned by one person, chayiv meiser behema. Interestingly enough, that one person doesn't actually even have to be a person, but that person could be what? An estate. An estate has the status of the individual, which is very useful. And I just want to point out, okay, Rabbi Yaakov Rappaport could speak about this more, right? But again, estates, at least in halacha, have two different identities, right? They have an identity ultimately, again, as an entity onto their own, like an estate, and there's a, we'll call this like a cheftza. An estate is a din in the gaver and a din in the cheftza. A little bit of a briska chakira over here. In other words, there's a cheftza of an estate, an entity called an estate, right? And then, but sometimes the estate ultimately, again, has the status of the individual, the father. Very interesting idea. So you see over here that legabi meiser behema, if there is an undivided estate, those animals essentially are considered to be the property of the father, the deceased father, and therefore chayiv in meiser behema. But the moment that we begin to divide things up and then reconstitute a partnership, halach l'maisa, that's jointly owned. Good. And by kalbon, again, we begin to see the same thing over and over. By kalbon, the halacha is going to be whenever one person gives the kalbon ultimately on behalf of someone else. So halacha l'maisa, they are going to go ahead and be chayiv, or when someone gives the machzah shekel on behalf of someone else, they're going to be chayiv to go ahead and halacha l'maisa give the kalbon. If it's a gift, then halacha l'maisa, again, one would not be chayiv for the kalbon. Good. So it says the Gemara as follows. The Gemara says, Rabbi Ba b'shem Rabbi Abba bar Rav Huna shnei achim sheyarshu es avien. So we'll say, so the Gemara says over here, there's no difference between two sons or two brothers who inherited their father, two sons-in-law who go ahead and inherit their father-in-law. That ultimately, again, they are like strangers who entered into a partnership, and the original estate is not put back together. So the Gemara says, so ultimately, again, so we'll say, switching gears for just a moment, where does the kalbon switch to? Where does the kalbon go to? So we'll say this whole time we're speaking about collecting the additional kalbon. Where does it go to? What do they do with the kalbon? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir Omer, L'shkalim, both is actually very interesting because, this whole time what we were discussing, right? The Mishnah introduced us to the concept of kalbon, which teaches us that Allah Lamaisa, when you give your machzis shekel, you have to pay that little additional amount. And the point of that additional amount was what? Was to go ahead and, well, at least it appeared, in order to ensure that you're giving a full machzis shekel. So the shaila then becomes, what did they do with the kalbon? Because we'll say, I want to point out something very interesting. We didn't get to this yet. But what you're going to see is that when it came to the machzis shekel, so not any coin could be used for machzis shekel. The collection was a very specific one, as we're going to get into. So what was the kalbon used for? So we'll say, so watch this. It says the Gemara, what did the kalbon, what was it used for? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir Omer l'shkalim. So Rabbi Meir says, ultimately, again, it went into the shekel collection. If you look at the Tikkun Chadatin, Rabbi Meir l'tamei d'amar la'el kashim sheshaklu Torah kach kalbon Torah. Now we'll say, Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, the din of kalbon is the din da'oraisa. He holds that the din of kalbon is mamish a part of the din of machzis shekel. So therefore, kalbon went into the same pot as machzis shekel. Okay, that's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Nadava. Rabbi Eliezer said it went into the Karban Nadava fund. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, although we'll see again exactly what Nadava means as well. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer Rikua. Rikua Zav Vitzipu the base Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri said about that it went for repairs. Literally again, Rikua Zav means plates of gold and coverings for the Kodesh HaKadosh, for the Holy of Holies. So it was used for repairs, for gold, for the Beis HaMikdash. Ben Azai Omer, Shulchanan Hayunotin Osim B'schar. Ben Azai said that the kalbon was the wage of the money changers, right? Remember, again, the money changers were in high demand, as you saw in the previous Mishnah, because people had to convert whatever their normative coinage was into a machzis shekel. So the money changers have to get paid for their time. So the fee that they got was the kalbon. Interesting enough, so you paid for a machzis shekel, plus a kalbon. That kalbon was kept by the money changers. The Gemara says, others say it wasn't really the wage of the money changers, but rather it was the travel expenses of the money changers. Good. Finish that first parak of Yerushalmi. Good. Mishnah, or Allah Aleph Mishnah. Also, this is very interesting. Also, listen to this. Now you have to understand, and we'll talk about this in greater depth. Every city had their collection boxes for machzis shekel. In other words, we do not make people go to the Beis HaMikdash in order to contribute their machzis shekel, because that would be an incredible imposition. So what would happen is every city would have collection boxes for machzis shekel. Now, obviously, after that, what has to happen? The machzis shekel has to be transported to Yerushalayim. So we'll say that's a lot of coins. So what would they do? They would exchange the machzis shekel for larger denominations. We'll see, isn't this interesting? So you see the process that's happening over here? I'm going to the money changer, exchanging my coin for machzis shekel, donating my machzis shekel, and then after the collection is done, they are reconverting the machzis shekel into larger coins, which we'll say tells you something. So why all the work? We'll see. So you see from here, by the way, that it's so important for the individual to give his machzis shekel. It is so important to highlight to every single individual that you matter. That you matter, that you have a chilik in the karbanos, that you have a chilik in the Beis HaMikdash, that you are counted, that you are important. So even though this creates an incredible amount of additional work, nevertheless, again, the hashkafa of machzis shekel is so dramatically important. So I will say they would redeem the shkalim for darkonos. We'll say a darkon is essentially a coin made up of 4 half shekels, or 2 shkalim, right? So two really four shkalim. Well, so we're going to see that actually what the Torah calls machzis hashekel is in the times of the Mishnah what they called a shekel. Those terms are really interchangeable. So essentially we're going to see that a darkon made up 4 machzis hashekel coins. And they did this because I will say obviously it lightens the load. When transporting the coins. The same way they were, we'll say a shofar is a collection box. We're going to see why was the collection box a shofar? Because it was shaped like a shofar. It was narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, right? Like an upside down shofar. For what purpose? So you could put coins in but you can't get anything out. That was the goal. So they're just same way that there were shofros in the mikdash, there were shofros in the cities. B'nei Ir sheshocha shekli. And Abba said, listen to this interesting case. What happens if you sent your shekel? So Abba said, so now remember, so now you live in Tel Aviv and you deposited your machzis shekel in the shofar. So now again they're taking the coins. Abba said, now watch this. The ganvo osha avdu. Let's say then what happens? Your shkalim are stolen or lost on the way. So the shkalim are being taken from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim, and now on the way they're stolen or lost. So now what's the shaila? What's my liability now for machzis hashekel? So the Gemara says as follows: Im nisra mahatruma. So it says we're going to see if halacha l'maisa, they already withdrew the money in the Beis Hamikdash. So it says we're going to see as follows. According to this approach, and this is really quite dramatic, when they would withdraw the money, right, they would withdraw the shkalim in the Beis Hamikdash to use for communal karbanos, they would withdraw the money with the intention on behalf of any money that was collected and any money which will be collected. So now what the Mishnah says is as follows. If at the time that the money was lost, nisra mahatruma, the collection was already done in the mikdash. When I say collection, I wouldn't say collection. I should say withdrawal. If the withdrawal was already done in the mikdash at the time the money was lost, then yishbain legizbarin. Then Abba said the people transporting the money take an oath to the gizbar, to the temple treasurers, that they did not misappropriate. V'imlav. But if not, in other words, if the temple withdrawal was not yet withdrawn, then nishba'in l'bnei ha'ir. Then ultimately, again, the transporters take a shvua to the residents of the city that they do not misappropriate, and in that case, ubnei ha'ir shoklin tachtein. Then Abba say the bnei ha'ir would have to donate another machzis hashekel. So Abba says, so bottom line, what it comes down to is as follows: everything depends on timing, like most things in life, right? Which is, if the machzis hashekel was lost prior to the withdrawal in the mikdash, then ultimately they would have to go ahead and contribute another machzis hashekel. If the loss occurred after the withdrawal, then it appears that halacha l'maaseh they would not have to go ahead and contribute again. Again, we'll see exactly how this works. So the Gemara says, what happens if they go ahead and they find? What happens if they go ahead and they find if you take a look, okay, fine. Okay, so much good. So what happens if they go ahead and they find? What happens if they go ahead and they find the lost or stolen shkalim? So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Elu ve'elu shkalim ve'in ol mehen l'shana haba. Both coins, the first coins and the second coins, both have the status of machzis hashekel. But I will say, interestingly enough, so you say, okay, no problem. Let's just credit one machzis hashekel for next year's collection. Doesn't work that way. I will say, in other words, shkalim collected this year can only work for this year, can't be credited towards next year. So again, we'll discuss exactly what you do with those coins. Says the Gemara, so we'll say, once you're telling me that halacha l'maisa, I can go ahead and exchange smaller coins for larger coins in order to lighten the load, I have a better idea. Why don't you exchange the coins for pearls? In other words, exchange it for some type of precious stone. Obviously, pearls are much lighter than anything, and a pearl could be worth, tens of shkalim. Doesn't that make it easier? To which the Gemara says, no, shema tazla magalios, v'nimtza hagdish mafsid. We're concerned that pearls depreciate. So because pearls depreciate, what can end up happening? Halach l'maisa, pearls depreciate, and you end up causing a loss to the Beis Hamikdash. Kehid taninan kavan, as we learned, the kulan niftin bekasef ubeshava kasef. In general, consecrated items can be redeemed onto money and to items of value. Chutz mishkalim, with the exception of shkalim, which cannot be redeemed onto objects, but can only be redeemed onto other forms of money. Vein podim bekalim, and we do not go ahead and redeem anything onto utensils. We are concerned that Allah the utensils will depreciate. V'nimtza hektish mafsid, and hektish will end up losing out. So to over here, we don't want anyone redeeming the coins onto pearls, lest you go ahead and have depreciation of the pearls and the Beis Hamikdash ends up losing out. To which the Gemara says, Masnisa betiklin chadatin. Our Mishnah is talking about nushkalim, aval betiklin atikin lo But with old shkalim, this is not the case. Now, what does that mean? If you take a look in the tiklin chadatin, now you see where the parish gets its name from. So we'll say tiklin chadatin. Remember, in Aramaic, a shin and a saf are interchangeable. So shiklin, tiklin, same thing. Look at the tiklin chadatin mas Nisan. Tiklin shayu shofros b'Medina. Dafka tiklin chadatin dahinu l'shkalim shel shana haba. Aval tiklin atikin dahinu l'mish lo shakal ishtakid lo hayu shofros b'Medina el tzarach la'avin la'mikdash dafka. So we'll say, interestingly enough, when we speak about this day that there are collection boxes for the shkalim, that was only for the current year's shkalim. So I will say, as we're going to discuss, what happens if you forgot to contribute your machzis shekel from last year? So you might have thought that's what? Done. No. Right? Whenever you owe money, right? It doesn't make a difference. You got to pay. So I'll say, so the idea is, however, interestingly enough, the collection boxes that were set up in local locations were only for the current year's shekel. If you forgot to bring last year's machzis shekel, that had to be brought to Yerushalayim. So the Gemara says, "Lo v'tani kenatikim b'mikdash v'natikim b'Medina." You can only contribute your old shkalim in the Beis Hamikdash and not in the Medina. Mas Nisan. Furthermore, again, the Gemara says, the Mishnah is b'shomer chinam. Both say now focusing a little bit on the case where the person transporting the shkalim lost them or it was stolen. Right? So the Gemara says the Mishnah is talking about a shomer chinam, an unpaid custodian. I will say again, and that's where the custodian could exempt himself by swearing, right? And the only variable is what? Who you swear to, right? First of all, when, right? When does the loss occur? And who you're swearing to, which are really tied to each other, right? If the loss occurred after they withdrew the money, then the shomer swears to the gizbar. If the loss occurred before the gizbar withdrew the money, then ultimately, again, he swears to the townspeople. But ultimately, again, with the shomer sachar, we'll say, remember again, a shomer sachar is chayiv for geneva v'aveda, right? A paid custodian is on the hook, is personally liable, even if property is stolen or lost. So this idea of the shomer exempting himself through a shvuah is only a din by shomer chinam, not a din by shomer sachar. Amrabi Abba v'afilu tem b'shomer sachar. Now you can even come up with the case of shomer sachar when nignevu b'listim mezuyin avdu b'misha tavas vinos avayam. Rabbi say, because remember again, a shomer sachar is pater when? For own sin, for extenuating circumstances, right? So for example, armed robbers would be an example of extenuating circumstances. Boat sinking would be an example of extenuating circumstances. So you could have a case of even a shomer sachar, even a paid custodian, exempting himself from liability with a shvuah. Amrav Yusti bar Simon, Asik Mandamar Tarmin ala Gavui, Va'ala Asid Legavu. So both say this Mishnah reflects the idea, this is really incredible, that when the Beis Hamikdash, when they withdraw the monies in the Beis Hamikdash, they withdraw it based on the money that has been collected and the money which will be collected. Which means that if your money is in transit, it is as if it is already in the coffers of the Beis Hamikdash being withdrawn. Pretty incredible. So we'll say ultimately again, the Gemara says, I'm sorry, I skipped the line here. So we'll say, and it appears from here, based on this Mishnah, that Allah Lamaisa, again, it would not reflect the opinion who holds that we do not collect based on that which is collected or will be collected. If you look at Tiklin Chadatin, he says over here, Lo bida, dilididei, afilo nitra mahatruma kodum shenevda, Kevan de intermin alagavoy lav nichnesa maos halal rishus hagizbar. So we'll say all the Gemara just pointed at saying the other side. Our Mishnah reflects the view that when they withdraw the funds from the coffers of the Beis Hamikdash, they're withdrawing it based on money collected and money which will be collected. Why? Because according to the other opinion, who holds then no, they only withdraw in the Beis Hamikdash for money that's what? That's been collected. According to that approach, when the money has been lost in transit, the shomer will always take his oath to the townspeople. Okay, just an interesting distinction. The Gemara says as follows: Bnei ha'ir sheshiklu ha'shikleim. Amr Rabbi Lazar, Reb Shimon Reb Shimon says, Kachim shu chai b'achriyus and kinichasapein. But Reb Shimon holds that Allah lamaisa. If you take a look at the last line of the Tikkun Chadatin, Reb Shimon, hadisam nasiz nashomim nishbain. Reb Shimon di'im lokein ha'karmel and eish ha'kdesh. So we'll say generally we have a concept that you don't take a shvuah over consecrated property, regarding consecrated property. Reb Shimon, however, is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, when you have a consecrated item for which you have personal responsibility, if something happens to it, you will take a shvuah. So our Mishnah clearly reflects the view of Reb Shimon, because remember, in this case where the shekalim have been lost, the shomer is taking a shvuah. The Gemara says, the Shimmy Batsheva Messing, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says, the truth is, everyone agrees with this principle in the Mishnah. What's the principle? If you are transporting Shekalim and you lose them, you have to take a shvuah. You have to take a shvuah. Everybody agrees that you have to take the shvuah. Why, Rabbi say? Because this shvuah is a takana derabanan. Takana derabanan. Why is it a bidding act? Last tickling on the page. Turn the page. Both say this is incredibly important. Rabbi Yochanan says, I'm sorry, back to Amal for just a moment. Rabbi Yochanan says that Allah Lamaisa, this shvuah is a takana d'Rabbanan. So you both say midda oraisa, we do not administer shvuas on consecrated items. That's midda oraisa. We'll discuss where that concept comes from. However, the rabbis legislated that Allah Lamaisa, if you're in charge of transporting maksas shekel, half shekel coins, and something happens, in order to exempt yourself from personal liability, you must take a shvuah. Now, I will say, the logic behind that is because we don't want people being derelict in their responsibility. In general, people are not as careful with stuff that is not their own. That's just the general klal. And they're even less careful with things that belong to the general public. So Chazal were concerned that if there's no level of liability for the person transporting the half shekel coins from the provinces to the Beis Hamikdash, then how is he going to be? Then what's the insurance policy that he's going to be careful? So therefore, Chazal instituted a shvuah. If something happens to the half shekel coins on your watch, you're chayiv a shvuah. The Gemara says, "Adas Rabbi Yochanan nechan nishbam legizbarim im lad nishalim ne'air ubnei shoklin achrei and tachtei." And so it's like according to Rabbi Yochanan, this makes sense. That's why again the Mishnah says the only variable will be who you're taking your shvuah to. Is the shvuah made to the gizbar? Is the shvuah made to the townspeople? However, the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazer, so ultimately, again, according to Rabbi Lazer, however, I understand why the shomer would have to go ahead and take a shvuah to the townspeople. That I understand, because again, he's chayiv in the achrayus of the maksas shekel. But why would he ever have to take a shvuah to the gizbar? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you. The Gemara says it means nishpoin libnei ha'ir b'maimad gizbarin. It means that Allah l'maisa, according to Rabbi Lazer, that the shomer will take a shvuah to the townspeople in the presence of the gizbar. Ki heiche dolach shedinu inami delo nishvuluhu poshim. So ultimately, again, because Rabbi said this way, the shomer kind of has to clear his name. Because if something it's not good. If something happens to maksas shekel, right? If you're driving the Brinks truck of the maksas shekel from the provinces to Yerushalayim, and something happens to your maksas shekel, that's not good. So according to Rabbi Lazer, the shvuah is actually taken meaning he takes it. The shvuah is taken. It's the wrong word. The shvuah is taken. Towards right. He owes a shvuah to the townspeople. But ultimately, again, the shvuah is taken not only towards the townspeople, but in the presence of the gizbar, really in an effort to totally clear his name. Because we'll say ultimately, again, that this is actually very interesting. What happens if the townspeople say, you know what, right, we'll call Ruvain was the transporter. They say, we trust Ruvain. Ruvain's a good guy. It's okay. It's okay. He doesn't have to take a shvuah. We're happy to contribute again. Let him off without the shvuah. The Gemara says, doesn't work. Ruvain must take a shvuah. Why must Ruvain take a shvuah? Ultimately, again, because ein hektish yotzei below shvuah. I will say a fascinating halacha. So the Gemara says over here, this is even though this is between Ruvain and the townspeople, halacha l'maisa, there is a rabbinic enactment that in order to go ahead and close out this process, the shomer must take a shvuah. And even if the townspeople want to release him from that liability, the halacha does not release him from liability. Pretty incredible. Hifr shiklo va'avad. So we'll say interesting halacha. So what happens if a person? There's a lot of really good pieces in the Rambam over here also, but just because of time, I don't think we're going to get to do it. Yeah, okay. You know what? You'll remind me. I owe it to you. All right, we'll get to it. Hopefully, maybe in a little bit. So Gemara says as follows. What about hifr shiklo va'avad? Interesting case. What happens if you went out and you separated out your maksas shekel and you lost it? You lost it. Rabbi Yochanan says, you are chayiv for that machzis hashekel until it reaches the hands of the gizbar. Right, until it reaches the hands of the temple treasurer. Rabbi Shimon Lakish Omer, hekdish b'rishus gava b'chol makom shu. This is very interesting. Rabbi Shimon Lakish says, once you separate it, it is in the presence of the Beis Hamikdash wherever it is. Wherever it is. So the Gemara says, Masnisa pliga Rabbi Shimon Lakish. The Mishnah argues Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Nishpa'in libnei ha'ir u'bnei ha'ir shuklin tachteyen lo od u'mishum shvuas takanas. Well, say interestingly enough. So interesting enough, the Gemara says, but the Mishnah seems to argue Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Because remember, what does Reish Lakish say? Reish Lakish holds that halacha l'maisa, once you separate out the machzis hashekel, that is considered to be the property of the Beis Hamikdash. And what that sounds like is, even if you lose it, you're not chayiv, right? Because really what it is it's a loss for the Beis Hamikdash. It's a loss for the Mikdash. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe not. When the Gemara says, masnisa pligi Reb Shimon Lakish, nishpon libnei ha'ir, u'bnei ha'ir sholim tachteyen. Because the Mishnah makes it sound like that if the machzis hashekel is lost, what's the halakha? You have to go and separate out the machzis hashekel. Lo odu mishum mishuas takana. So I'll say, ultimately, again, it could very well be that the obligation to give another machzis hashekel is kind of part and parcel of this obligation of shavua. That it could be that midda oraisa, once you separate out your machzis hashekel, you're done. You're done. And if it gets lost, that's a loss to the Beis Hamikdash, not a loss to you. But halacha l'maisa, it's possible that because of the shvuas takana, ultimately we go ahead and we make him separate it out again. So I'll say, so it is interesting. I will share with you over here. So this is Parag Gimel halachas ches and tes. So interestingly enough, okay, you know what? Let's finish first. Let's finish. So much good halacha with this. Okay, focused. So the Gemara says as follows: Tani, harishon noflim letiklin charatim, hashnim noflim letiklin atikin. Suppose remember again, the Mishnah said. So what happens if halacha lamaisa you end up going ahead and contributing? So remember, let's say they find the first shkalim. They end up finding the first shkalim. So what's the halacha? So the first shkalim ultimately will become tiklin chadatin, and the second ones will become tiklin atikin. So now when the Gemara is explaining this a little bit, the first set, right? Because remember, the lashon of the Mishnah was elu v'elu shkalin vein olin hein l'shana haba. So the Mishnah said if they end up finding the lost shkalim, everything has the din of machzis hashekel. Everything has the din of machzis hashekel. But ultimately, again, you can't credit anything to next year's collection. So I'll say, okay, when we say both are shkalim, what does that mean? So now the Gemara kind of fills in the blank. Tani harishon noflim letiklin charatin. The first ones become the new shkalim, which sounds like this year's shkalim. V'ashniyim noflim letiklin atikin. And the second ones fall into a collection pot known as old shkalim, tiklin atikin. So I'll say, so we'll discuss, by the way. So new shkalim, I understand what they're used for. Old shkalim we'll have to discuss. But I'll say, what's the problem? Which one is the first? Which ones are the first ones? Which ones are the second ones? Right? Once you hear what the Gemara just said, the first ones are the new shkalim, and the second ones are the old shkalim. Thank you. Which ones are the first? Which ones are the second? Rabbi Pinchas ben Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Abamari, Chad Amar, Elu sheshalchu b'nei ha'ir tchila. So we'll say, so one opinion says, the first ones are the first ones they sent. Those are the first ones. Charna said, Elu shegiel yadin gizbar tchila. And Charna said, no, the first ones, ultimately again, are the first ones which reach the gizbar. So I'll say, machlokes, ultimately again, a machlokes in which is first and which is second. Is it the first ones which were donated, or is the first, ultimately, again, the first ones which reached the hands of the Gizbar? So that's a machlokes. The Rambam happens to paskin in Halacha Tesvav over here, and this is in where? In Perek Gimel, Hilchos Shkalim. So the Rambam paskins, first of all, I'll just say, we'll say, all right, fine, you twist the arms. Listen to this. So the Rambam says, Misha, this is Perek Gimel Halacha Ches, Misha avad shiklo chai bachri yusach shim shana Gizbar. Both say the way we paskin Halacha Lamaisa is you have personal responsibility for your machzis hashekel until it reaches the hands of the Beis Hamikdash, until it reaches the hands of the Gizbar. B'nei ha'ir, both is very important. So you separate a machzis hashekel, something happens to it, you're personally responsible until it gets the hands of the Beis Hamikdash. What happens if you sent it with a shaliach? So then the Rambam goes through that whole case. So we'll say, if you sent your machzis hashekel with a shaliach, and then something happened to the machzis hashekel, Then I will say, interestingly enough, it depends on who you sent it with. Is it a shomer chinam? Is it a shomer sachar? Right? Is it ultimately, again, an unpaid custodian, a paid custodian? So I say, either way, the shomer has to take a shvua about what it is that occurred. What happens then if halacha l'maaseh they find the first shkalim? And I will say, by the way, essentially what happens in all cases where the machzis hashekel is lost, what's the halacha, Rabbi say? What's the halacha? You have to replace it. Because remember, again, this is why the Rambam adds these halachas in this sequence. The first halacha is that the machzis hashekel is not considered to be collected until it reaches the hands of the gizbar, which means until it reaches the hands of the Beis HaMikdash, you're responsible for it. Which means even if you give it to a shaliach, ultimately, again, the halacha is if that shaliach loses it, you're still responsible. Now, again, the shliach may be responsible depending on the type of his shlichus. But halacha l'maisa, assuming that the shliach is exempt, he took a shavua, he's exempt, I have to pay the second shekel again. So what happens if we find the first shkalim? So we'll say ultimately again, both. So it turns out that year I'll end up donating 2.5 shekels. So as we're going to see, the first ones become tiklin chadatin this year shkalim. The second ones, or the old ones, become last year shkalim. So we'll say then the Rambam goes on. He says, okay, we have to go back there. We'll say, so that's the halacha. That's the halacha. You are personally responsible for your machzas shekel until it reaches the hands of the Beis Hamikdash. So if you send it with a shaliach and it gets lost, so there's 2 halachas. What's the halacha of the shaliach? Depends if he's a paid custodian, unpaid custodian. Either way, he can't be released from liability until he takes a shavua. But once he releases himself from liability, I'm still back on the hook. So I have to give another machzis hashekel. If it turns out that they find the lost or still machzis hashekel, both shkalim are consecrated. One goes for this year's shekel, one goes for quote unquote last year's shekel. Now, what it means to be collected for last year's shekel, still remains to be seen. Mishnah, Hanosin shiklo lechaber lishkal yado. Listen, in this case, I give my friend the machzas shekel and say, listen, Ruvain, do me a favor. Here is my machzas shekel. Go ahead and contribute it on my behalf. And Ruvain decides to keep it for himself and contribute it on his own behalf. What's the halacha? Nitshma truma mala shokel. If once the withdrawal was done, so Ruvain has committed mi'ilah because he's effectively misappropriated Beis Hamikdash property. This goes with the idea that once the withdrawal was done for that which is collected and that which will be collected. Im nitshma truma mala shokel. Shokel min ha'hekdesh v'nitshma truma. So ultimately again, if one goes out and contributes a machzas shekel from a coin that is already consecrated, the nitra mahatruma, and the withdrawal was done, the karba behema, and the animal was offered, mal, he's committed mi'ilah. So the Gemara says, if a person gave machzas shekel, ultimately again from a coin which was vested with meiser sheni sanctity or shvius sanctity, he should eat something corresponding to the value of the coin. We'll see what that means in just a moment. Says the Gemara, hashokel. Anan taninan im karva habehema, v'tani dibei Rebbe im nitra mahatruma. So we'll say 2 different versions over here. When does the individual misappropriate the machzas shekel? When does he commit mi'ilah? One version says only after an animal has been offered. Other version says that ultimately once the withdrawal has been done. Skip the parentheses. Man tana im nitra mahatruma. Who is the opinion who says once the truma has been taken? Right, halacha l'maisa. Because remember again, I'll say once the withdrawal has been done on the Beis Hamikdash, then halacha l'maisa, the withdrawal is done based on the coins which have been collected and which will be collected. So once the withdrawal has been done, then halacha l'maisa, Ruvain, who took my machzas shekel that I gave him to contribute for me, and he used it to contribute for himself that he's committed in mi'ilah. Whose opinion is that? Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, miyad haya mekaba ma'osav. So again, this is actually part of a different discussion. In general, in the Beis Hamikdash, if you remember, the Beis Midrash had to buy large amounts of flour, wine, oil, livestock. So the shaila there was, when do the merchants get their money? Do they get paid upon delivery of the goods, or do they get paid only once the goods are used? Now, we'll say, now, why would you pay them only once the goods are used? There's a very good reason, which is what? Spoilage, right? There's a concern about spoilage, because remember, again, if the Beis Hamikdash pays for something and they can't end up using it, that's really going to be a bit problematic. So Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, you pay the vendors immediately. You pay them right upon receipt. Why? Because Kohanim's reason, because ultimately, again, the Kohanim are Zoris. They are alacritists, right? They do their avodah very quickly, and therefore Allah Chalamayis says no concern regarding spoilage. The Kasha, the Gemara says, but this poses a question against the first case in the Mishnah. If a person were to go out and steal the olah of his friend and then shecht it without specific intent, the both say we assume that Allah an olah that is offered up stam, even though it was stolen, atones for the owner, because a stam, a regular, right, a power of intent should be a default intent to original owner. If that's the case, then Allah same thing when I give Ruvain my machzis a shekel, and ultimately he contributes it on he takes it for himself and he gives it. If he gives it with non-specific intent, it should work for my obligation. On Rabbi Yudan Tipater b'misuyam mishal beis Rabbi Gamliel. Shaya miskavei midach lo soch hakup. Rabbi says we're going to see that Allah. We'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up in Meretz Hashem with this piece tomorrow about when you take something, but then go ahead and offer it up with non-specific intent. Does the item ultimately lapse back to its default setting, or does it take on its stolen setting in Meretz Hashem to be continued tomorrow? All right, Chevron Zoom. I'll say those of you who I'll see over Yom Tov, look forward to seeing over Yom Tov. But those of you who are away, have a wonderful, wonderful Yom Tov. Chag kosher b'sameach, a good Shabbos, and it's a great schus to learn with all of you. I'm actually looking at all of you. I'm just looking at my computer screen. Shekalim, everyone. Bye, shalom aleichem. How are you?